Senator Sally Anwar, Dr. Catherine Herms, Beth Caruso, and Catherine Carmen, my very esteemed panelists. Welcome to the Old Steakhouse, this beautiful place, and we're going to learn more about why we're here in a few minutes. Welcome to this very important discussion as we close out Women's History Month. The Connecticut witch trials are not a story of witchcraft. They are a story of something much more sinister, a deep-rooted misogyny that has plagued our country for centuries. And for 15 years, Connecticut tried women and men for the crime of witchcraft, executing at least 11 people. 9 of them were women. And these women were really victims of a society that punished them for speaking out and speaking up, maybe dressing a little bit differently, inheriting land, or just simply because someone in their community didn't like them. And men, like Governors John Haynes and Thomas Wells, and Deputy Governor John Mason, who served as magistrates of the first trials, gave validity to the accusations against them. They handed down guilty verdicts and death sentences based only on the words and imaginations of neighbors. Community leaders like Reverends Thomas Hooker and Samuel Stone fed the flames of the hysteria, encouraging confessions and further accusations. Now here we are, more than 300 years later, not far from where some of the executions happened. And we can see that wrong was done. And unfortunately, we still see that the rights of women are being attacked by men in power across the country. So as we close out this Women's History Month, we want to express remorse for past injustices and also use these stories of women to propel us toward the work that we need to accomplish today. And my legislative friends, Rep. Garibay and Senator Anwar, are the people who are very strong advocates of the rights of women in Connecticut, and I'm so grateful that they're here, and I'm grateful for all of our panelists being here to help tell this important story. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to the person who decided to make this her mission after others have tried and not been successful, but she is one tenacious leader, Representative Garibay.
Governor, I'm just so happy that we can all be here to tell this story. If you had asked me in 2017, I didn't know much about it except for we were exonerating those accused of witchcraft and executed in Windsor, Connecticut. So that was done, and that began my journey. And people ask, what's it about? We'll talk more about that as we get into the discussion. But history is important. History is important, and we need to learn from history, not just in this case, but everything that happens and we leave behind. We need to remember it, so how do we move forward? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Garibay. And I want to turn to Senator Sally Anwar, who is co-sponsoring this bill, to explain why he is doing that and the significance of the bill in your estimation, Senator, hundreds of years after the event occurred.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor, for your leadership and bringing us all together. Many months ago, somebody had approached me from my community, and this individual said, I needed to ask you for a favor. And I asked them, tell me what I can do to help you. And the person informed me that many generations ago, his ancestor was involved in prosecuting the witches in the state of Connecticut, as he put it. And this was associated with trauma, and then he felt that it's important to be able to address that and exonerate them, because that was one way to be able to say that we did wrong and his ancestors did wrong and the state of Connecticut did wrong and we need to fix that. And then I actually have to recognize the fact that I did not know as much. And as I started to do the research, it was scary, because before there was Salem, there was Hartford, there was Connecticut. And arguably, Salem looked at Connecticut as their model to do what they did. And the more I learned about it, I said, this is unacceptable, and then we have to have the conversation and address this, because if we wait for more time to say we are sorry and wrong was done, it will be more late, and then we can go into depth of our interactions and the community that we've developed around these conversations. So thank you so much, Madam Lieutenant Governor.
Thank you. I couldn't ask for a better partner in doing this, having it in the House and in the Senate, and I thank you. Beth, you wrote the book of One Windsor. You've written 2 books, right? Based on the execution of Windsor's Alcee Young. Can you tell us about Alcee and what her story was?
Sure. Alice Young was the very first person convicted and hanged for witchcraft in the American colonies. She was the spark that started the witch hunts in New England. Alice Young was living in Windsor, Connecticut in 1647 when she was accused of witchcraft. What happened was there was an influenza epidemic that went through town. And through research, Kathy Hermes and I discovered that Alice Young was living right next door to a family that lost 4 children in that epidemic. Alice Young had 1 child, so that brought her under suspicion because it was expected that every good woman be fertile, and she only had 1 child, so that 1 child lived while these others died. In addition to that, the town minister lost 2 children in that epidemic. The town doctor lost a child, and there were people in the legislature that lost children too. Another strike against Alice was we do have some educated speculation that she was a healer. And because of that, she may also have been a target.
So let me ask you, Beth, some say that because men could be targeted by accusers during this period of history, that misogyny wasn't a major factor. What's your opinion on that? Is it a factor or not?
I disagree with that statement. It's actually a huge factor. I mentioned it with Alice Young. Fertility was a huge thing back in the day. You had the role of women was to be fertile, take care of the children, both for religion. They were saying, be fruitful and multiply at the pulpits. But we have to understand it was also extremely political in those days too. They were trying to build their population and overcome native populations and the Dutch population. So if you didn't fall under that criteria of being a good woman, being fertile, and that also included being a submissive woman, if you spoke your mind, if you were outside of that little box, you could be targeted. The fact also that the 2 men who were hanged, they were connected to women, and more women across the board were accused, convicted, indicted, and hanged. And the tests that they had to endure to prove, again quotes, they were a witch, no man had to endure. For example, one of the proofs, let's say neighbors talked about you, had suspicions about you, to prove that someone was a witch in those days, to convict someone. There were various different things that we would never think of today, at least most people wouldn't think of, that would be proper evidence to convict someone of a crime. One of those things might be searching their bodies for witches' teats, which are basically skin tags, or moles, things like that. So a skin tag, finding a skin tag, would be something that could actually get someone convicted of witchcraft as confirmation that neighbors, that their gossip was true. Also, spectral evidence could do it. Someone would have a dream in the middle of the night and say, this person pinched me. You know, so absolutely, misogyny ran through it.
Great. Kathy, we don't usually exonerate people of crimes committed in the past unless there's a grave miscarriage of justice. Do you legally, do the witch accusations and convictions fit that standard in your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. So these women were accused of basically something we would say today could not have happened, which is actually, sort of meeting the devil and making a compact with the devil. That's not to say people can't do evil things, but this was a sort of a physical compact with the devil. We know that can't happen. Moreover, they were subjected to a lot of procedures that today we wouldn't allow. So, for example, they were not allowed any attorneys. And that was true of basically anybody accused of a crime back then. But in witchcraft cases, because they were subjected to intensive examination of their bodies, but also long interrogations that would last sometimes days and weeks. So without counsel, they were not permitted to confront their witnesses because the testimony against them was spectral, right? So they weren't able to do something that we take for granted, being able to cross-examine the evidence and testimony against us. And they also, because the Puritans believed in sort of equitable procedures, that is, in open courtrooms where anybody could talk, that could normally be beneficial to people from the lower orders who didn't understand the law. But in this case, it opened the courtroom to gossip. And so essentially these women were convicted on gossip with faulty evidence, with supernatural evidence, and then 11 of them, at least 11 of them, were executed. And that is a gross miscarriage of justice. They had no way to defend themselves against this in a legally proper way.
Kathy, you've done some very extensive academic research and writing on this topic. As someone who's a historian and an expert in early colonial law and Puritanism, why do you think exoneration is important now for the state to do?
So I think exoneration is important because history lives on, right? So many of these people had families, and as the generations went on, their families carried this stigma with them. And if you think that's an exaggeration, think about the famous novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne, who literally changed his name because his ancestor was a judge in the Salem trials. Right? That stigma followed people and traumatized people. People lost their mothers and their grandchildren, and every generation was affected by this. Moreover, we recognize other wrongs. So take, for example, the governor of Louisiana just recently exonerated Homer Plessy, he of the separate but equal case back in 1896. Plessy was convicted of sitting in the wrong railroad car. He was a black man who sat in the white car, right? And the governor of Louisiana recognized he didn't really commit a crime. That should not have been a crime, and it was an injustice, and exonerated him. These were injustices that lived on and resonate. And Senator Anwar's example is another example of that resonation. So yes, we've got to do it now. We also have evidence that witchcraft accusations are going on right now. In a recent UN statistic, 20,000 people are under suspicion or accusations of witchcraft in over 60 countries around the world. So exoneration today in Connecticut means we're taking a stand against an ongoing problem.
Well, it's actually a human rights violation.
Yes.
Right, and so as you were speaking, Kathy, I wanted to ask both legislators whether you've heard from families within the state of Connecticut or outside that have asked you to do this work, because you alluded to that, and I think it's very important.
So once we didn't know how important or big this was going to be, we just were looking for exoneration. When we had our hearing, we had people fly from California, Colorado, Pennsylvania. I've gotten letters, and it's just been amazing, you know, how it has followed down the generations, the stories. And one was a grandmother from Pennsylvania, and she said, "What do I tell my grandkids? They know. How do I explain this?" So it has impacted many people's lives.
And I actually have similar experience as well. It's before I tell you about the individuals who have contacted me, I just want people to step back and recognize the fact that if people 9 or 10 generations later still look at this as very little part of the injustice done to their family members, tells you that one generation told their stories to the next generation, to the next generation. So this is a generational pain and trauma that has been transmitted to the family members to say, this was wrong. Wrong was done to your grandmother and great-great-grandmother. And those emotions have remained very alive. And I was contacted, I'll share with you a specific one. I think it's out of Tennessee. There's a gentleman in his late 70s who has even difficulty speaking. But this was, and he sent me a whole letter with attachments by snail mail. And he had been sending letters to every president for the past many presidents, and then asking for exoneration at that level, to the point that he actually sent a letter to the Department of Justice and to the former governors for the state of Connecticut. And then finally, when he saw this bill come through, he put in emotions about the fact that he was hoping that before he would pass, that he would see something like this. So can you imagine having this emotion to be able to say that I'm looking forward to my great-great-grandmother, great-great-great-grandmother to actually be exonerated? As soon as I got the letter, there was a phone number. I called him, and I was worried about his health. So I said, I'm a state senator. I want you to know that I'm so sorry this happened to your great-grandmother. And we will do what we can to stand up and say wrong was wrong, and we are, as the state of Connecticut, sorry. And he was very emotional when he heard this, and he just said thank you, because he wants to hear this. And I think we owe it to the families who are around and the families who are not around to be able to say that we are sorry as the state of Connecticut, because in the colonial time we murdered innocent women and a couple of men, and we changed the lives and the trajectory of the lives for many families, and many of those families were impacted for the remaining part of their lives, and generationally were impacted too. So this is how I felt about some of the conversation I've had.
And I will just share that I heard from a former legislator, a state senator who represented Weathersfield and Middletown and Rocky Hill, Paul Doyle, who said that he tried his best when he represented his district to get something done. And he said he was very grateful to Representative Garibay and Senator Anwar for moving it much farther forward and having, because of their tenacity, having the ability to have a much more robust and serious discussion than had happened in the past. So I wondered if either of you would want to share sort of the status of this as we're looking at the legislature closing in June.
Right. So it was sent out of judiciary. Now it'll go to, hopefully to the floor, and it'll be up to our leadership whether, you know, it gets called on the floor. It'll come out in the House first. We're excited because we think we have the votes to make this happen. Once that happens, then it goes over to Senator Anwar to pass in the Senate, and then it'll get sent to the governor for signing, and we will have a huge celebration.
Now, the senator and I have a little pull in the state senate.
Yes.
Just a little bit.
All right. Yes. Hey, Catherine, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you got involved in this issue?
My name is Catherine Carmen. I'm 14 years old and I'm a resident of Windsor, Connecticut. I'm a freshman at East Catholic High School and I have 2 sisters. I'm strongly opinionated and I believe in standing up for what you believe in, no matter the age. And I was first approached by Ms. Caruso. She was looking for a young person's opinion on this case, and when she informed me of the unfortunate occurrences that happened so long ago in my very own town, I felt an obligation to do whatever I could to fight for what I believe in, and I believe in exoneration for these people. So I'm going to use I'm going to use my power to use my voice and do whatever I can to get justice for these people.
And I understand that you had a pretty robust debate in the Judiciary Committee, and I feel like we have a future lawyer on our hands if you choose to go down that route. And Jane, you want to talk about that back and forth, or would you talk about sort of what arguments you heard against exoneration and what you would say as that committed young person to the other side?
One of the questions that I remember being frequently asked was, why now? And my answer was, why not now? I feel like we've waited so long already, I don't understand. We know our state has done wrong. We know we can acknowledge it. We have the resources, we have the power, we have the time. So I really don't see a better time than now. And I remember thinking to myself, why is this such an issue that it's taken 300 years? It's 300 years. We should be ashamed of that, and we should use that as a fueling to get this done quicker and to really pass this through. And I think me being a young person and standing up for what I believe in and acknowledging I'm from this town and this does affect people and this affects our generations. Obviously, if you have a 14-year-old girl standing up there getting grilled by some people, I think that being asked those questions really just proved the importance of the issue, and being able to answer those questions and to have a rebuttal and to have disagreements and to be able to word those disagreements really opened the eyes of some people and hopefully convince them to push us along, keep it going, and make progress however we can.
So, go ahead. That's good. We were very proud of you because you handled yourself extremely well, and I think that was a surprise to some people that you had that passion in you and knowledge to counteract some of the things said, so it was great.
And we were cheering you on when you did that, and I think that, oftentimes when we have young people come to the state legislature and testify about issues that are important to them, it can even change minds of curmudgeonly legislators. And I'll say I was one of those. I heard young people testify and said, wow, what a great idea, even though, before I heard them speak, I maybe wasn't a fan. So thank you for bringing your passion to the state legislature. And as you look at this history in our state, what saddens you the most, or what caused you? What is it about that made you so motivated to go to the legislature and speak?
What I think upset me the most about these witch trials is that the punishment was death, and death is irreversible. These were lives lost. We read about them now in history books, but these were real people with families, with friends, with loved ones. And this death was not easy, it was not quick, it was not painless. There were motions and ideas created to make this more painful for the victims. And the fact that these people were killed because of at least one wrongful accusation by at least only one wrong person baffles me. And I think wrapping minds around the concept that these people suffered and these people were innocent, and even 375 years later, trying to understand and grasp the reality of these cases and the reality of their innocence is something that needs to be understood and further looked into.
And let me ask this question, and Catherine, we can start with you, but I'd love to hear from our experts as well. Why is it that people in our country tend to know more about the Salem witch trials? Why are they more top of mind than the witch trials of Connecticut?
I think that the witch trials in Salem were more broadcasted or more known about widely because of the circumstances, of more burnings, of the more brutality of the case and the reality of it. But I think that it's important to recognize that Hartford came first, and this was, as previously stated, this can be seen as inspiration in a way. I think that the fact that Salem was able to exonerate their witches just proves that Hartford should be able to do this too. Our state has the power to. If anyone else can, we can do the same. I have faith in Connecticut that we can do that. And I think that the power of these witches and the power of these victims, these people wrongfully accused, can only be shown more and more as we look at more witch trials through America. I think that in Hartford, although it was earlier and still it was before the colony became the state, I think that it's important to recognize how far along we've come in our locations, and we're able to right our wrongs there. Why not do it now?
Well said. And any of our two experts want to add to anything that she's said?
Yeah, I do think that, Salem, they had more accusations, partly because Massachusetts, at the time, was trying to get a new charter. It had been under a government called the Dominion of New England that essentially closed all courts except for the court of Warrior and Terminer. And so that meant that for years, grievances had been building up. And so in Salem and then in Andover and other adjacent towns, there were over 400 accusations. It was a very big deal. Secondly,
the numbers were bigger.
The numbers were just huge, right? So Connecticut, the accusations in Connecticut were not as big because, as you may know, our charter was hidden in the Charter Oak, our government was preserved, and so the same type of situation with the courts didn't happen. So that's one thing. The other thing is that a number of famous people were attached to those trials. Samuel Sewall, who was one of the judges, was also the first person to publish he was the first person to publish an anti-slavery tract in America. And so he was a famous judge whose diaries were published, and he had some recognition. John Hawthorne, the ancestor of Nathaniel Hawthorne, was well known. But I will say that Salem didn't really come to the fore until the publication of the Crucible. That's when it really, became something in popular culture. And then in the 1950s and 60s, there started to be books written about Salem. Before that, it too was hidden history. And we sometimes don't recognize that people tried to suppress this kind of thing for generations because it was shameful.
So this is for anyone that wants to answer. We've kind of touched on why this exoneration is important and saying we're sorry, but there are those that say this wasn't the state of Connecticut, this was the Commonwealth, we had nothing to do with it. Would anyone like to comment on that?
Sure. Yes, it wasn't the state of Connecticut, but we do go back in history and we celebrate colonial people before we became a state. And we embrace them. So why can't we embrace this history as well? We've also talked about generational trauma. And we're talking about trauma that went well into statehood. The other part of this is you can ask any historian, were these people witches? They will say, were they guilty of witchcraft? And they will say no, based on the records that we do have. But the government of Connecticut, whether it be colonial or state, has never officially corrected the record. And so this is extremely important for, I think, for everyone to acknowledge what actually happened in our state or in the space that became a state.
There's also a legal answer to this. We're continuously operating under the same charter. So the charter that John Winthrop Jr. brought back in 1662 went through the American Revolution. We didn't write a new constitution until 1818. How did they run the government? When there was independence, that charter was simply moved into a governing constitution, right? So it's a continuous government. There's no reason we broke from the king. That relationship's ended. It's in our hands now.
I would just have a question. Representative Garibay and Senator Anwar heard from the descendants of the victims. I'm just curious if anyone has heard from descendants of the prosecutors.
I have, and then that's how I started to learn about this. And the trauma is very much there, and it's very real as well, because they've been carrying that burden. Now, if you look at the fact that there was a burden on the part of the families who were, the loved ones were murdered, they transmitted that from generation to generation. When I heard that 10 generation, in this case it was a 9th generation later, somebody knows about their family member being in that position, that tells you that they have heard that somebody did wrong so many generations ago in their family. And then you think about that trauma itself, and it is also very real, and this is going to help those communities and those families as well.
Right. And I remember you were asked, was there proof that they're innocent? You know, we live in a country where you are innocent until proven guilty. So the question back was, what proof do you have that they were witches? And William was with us. He was a 9-year-old from St. Gabriel's School who also came to the hearing. And he talked about what happened to the children of those that were executed for witchcraft. One was sold to the sheriff's sons for indentured servitude until he was 21 years old. And so what that did to his life, and it just cascades down as we talk about that trauma. But, right? Are there any other cases that you guys found that were just really overwhelming of our 11 victims?
Well, I want to say that because there are no trial records left in Connecticut, we know about these cases through slander cases, or in the case of Samuel Willis, his papers, his diaries. And I think the case of Goody Knapp is quite remarkable, because Roger Ludlow, a revered founder of Connecticut, was the one who accused Goody Knapp. And Goody Knapp had to go through searches, she had to go through torture, and Goody Knapp was an absolute hero. Despite going through all that, Goody Knapp refused to name other witches. She refused to name other people, and she stood her ground. So even though these histories can be dark at times, they are still full of inspirational people. And in Connecticut, we really haven't told the stories that much thus far. I hope this is, discussing this right now, I hope is extremely positive for Connecticut. Perhaps there can be a formal exhibit that talks about the whole witch trial history, or a historical trail through the towns where this happened. But it's an interesting history, and it applies to today, the lessons that can be learned.
I would also like to just say, Beth and I have been texting about various cases from time to time, so that's why I'm on my phone. It's not, and I shared a document with Beth that actually is one of my biological ancestors. I'm an adoptee, so this is not a story that came down to me through, family lore. But John Barlow of Fairfield gave evidence in a witchcraft case. And his evidence, which is on the State Library website, and you can see the original document there, testifies to the fact that he was sleeping at a house where Mercy Disborough worked as a servant. And apparently he had some former relationship with her, and they had had a fight. And in his dream, she comes to him and stands over him and pinches his feet. And this is the evidence he gives against her that she was a witch. And it's right here, on my phone if you want to see it later, in his, in handwriting. So the kinds of testimonies, they're quite vivid, and it really does show, I think, the level of malevolence in some of these testimonies. She broke up with him. This is essentially a spurned lover who then imagines her in a position of power over him, doing physical damage to him at night in his bed. I mean, it couldn't get more Freudian.
Well, we have a very nice audience here in the beautiful old State House, and why don't we do this? Why don't we take a few questions? We have these amazing experts here. If there are any questions, we have a microphone, so any questions from our audience about?
As we were waiting, do you mind if I make a quick little comment?
Please, go
So,
ahead.
earlier there was we touched on the topic of why is it that people don't know as much about what has happened in Connecticut. And I think this is also an area of opportunity for us as residents of the state of Connecticut to shed some light on our history. Even though this is not a history that we should be very proud of, but we should be proud of the fact that we are standing up in 2023 to undo and stand up for what was wrong. And if we do that, even when we put this bill forward, the information about this bill is not only local, national, it is international. There is publications in parts of Europe and other parts of the country and the world that are talking about a bill in the state of Connecticut. And I think these stories need to be shared. If we do not talk about these atrocities that were committed, and also talk about the heroes in the picture as well, because they were heroes. Every time there's wrong, there is right as well in the picture. And we have a governor at that time who stood and was a voice of reason and took the right decisions. So if we have an opportunity to raise the awareness, and then as Beth was suggesting, even have a trail and an exhibit and talk to people, because not only the people in Connecticut want to learn about it, the rest of the country is also interested to learn about Connecticut and come here for that purpose.
And the Connecticut Historical Society and other places should take note. And I'm curious from our experts, were there towns outside of, states outside of Connecticut and Massachusetts that had similar trials?
Sure, New Hampshire and Virginia as well. Actually the first accusation that led to a conviction was in Virginia, but there were no laws in place that the penalty should be death. And this woman had to just pay tobacco in fines.
And, New York also had some cases, and of course, in what's now the United States and some of the Spanish territories, there were also accusations.
And was it in the same time frame, 16 and 1700s?
Yeah, in New York, it went into the 18th century. There was what is referred to as a slave insurrection in New York that actually really wasn't. But there were some witchcraft accusations there in 1741.
And so the convictions and executions were only in Massachusetts and Connecticut, though? By and large? She mentioned define, is that in Virginia?
Yeah, that was in Virginia. The New England ones are the only ones that I know of as far as death, but people are being recognized in those other states because they suffered. A lot of them spent months and months in jail. They lost, their place in society, so they suffered. So that's why we put those who were indicted into the bill as well, because they really did pay a great price for being indicted.
In the New York case, there were people, they were actually burned in New York, the people in the slave insurrection. But I don't think it was explicitly for witchcraft that they were burned, so they're not counted among the victims of those accusations. But I think that did follow them. There was a Catholic priest, or thought to be a former Catholic priest, who was accused. That was a strange.
Catherine, this has been pretty much in the news, and you've been in the newspaper, so I'm sure that your colleagues at school, etc., have seen it. What has their reaction been, just to understand where the younger generation?
My classmates and people that I go to school with, they approach me about this case and say, I had no idea any of this ever happened. I was like, yeah, that's the problem. We should. I'm working for justice. I'm using my voice to speak to people. I've been talking to my teachers. They've been giving their opinions, and I've been informing everyone of the long overdue justice. And a lot of people have been amazed that we're able to come so long. But people ask questions. Why is this so important? Why did this happen? Why has nothing been done yet? And all I can say is, there's no reason for that.
It's good to have questions, though. It's
Yeah.
good that they're asking.
People have been intrigued, people have been curious, and it's good to ask those questions because it brings up awareness, and I like answering them because it brings up information, and it brings up information as to why this needs to happen and why it needs to happen now.
All right. Yes, sir.
I'd like to make a comment. I've been on this for many years. In 2005 I started. But something came up on the news today. Somebody had a question. In the 1600s, we came under the authority of the King of England. And why isn't this being dealt with by England instead of the colonies? Well, in March 31st of 2007, I actually wrote to the Queen of England. And by November 15th of 2007, I received a response from her staff. And they basically stated, I have a copy of it here for you can view it later on. They basically stated that in order for England to handle these cases, all those cases would have to be reopened, which is highly unlikely because many of the colonial records here in Connecticut are no longer in existence. Additionally, they said that because the governor in the state of Connecticut had no power to pardon people, and still doesn't have any power to pardon people, it should fall to the governor in the colonies. So basically, to answer that question, why shouldn't it be dealt with by England? England has dumped it back in our lap. Thank you.
Yeah, as you were doing that reasoning, I think we went in a very big circle. And here we are, but that's okay, our legislators are on it, so that's the good news.
Basically, all we're saying is we're sorry that happened to you. It's not about reparation, it's not about anything else. Like you said, it's just telling people we're sorry this happened to you and clearing their names.
Can I add to that perspective? Governor Winthrop, he was the one who was involved with Charles II to be able to get the charter and then be able to have the local control, and that's when he started taking the right position and saying no more. And then that speaks about the history of our governors being on the right side of history from that perspective, at least when they were able to have the England not be in control at that point.
And I'll just say that John Mason has come up in a number of other contexts, and
We're going to talk about that.
well, all I'm saying is there's a lot to fix when we get through with this. There are other subjects too.
Because when Governor Winthrop was here, there wasn't that problem. Before he left, after he came home, it was during the period that John Mason was in charge. So,
I do think that it's important to remember that, historical figures are complicated, right? And so it's not a case of this person's good and this person's bad, and they're always consistently good and bad. I think that, maybe John Mason could be an exception, but
All right, the historian just said that.
But I think, there are many great things that Puritans brought to the world, including, and this is often not remembered, but religious toleration. The whole idea of political toleration was something that emerged out of English Puritanism and their Republican philosophies.
And then the irony is these witch trials show a lack of tolerance, right?
Exactly. Which I think is the part of the complication of history, right? That people don't behave in consistent ways. And this is a real lesson. It's a real chance for us to embrace the whole history and not just cherry pick it.
and the world is watching. We've done interviews, and there's been articles in New Zealand, Australia. I think BBC was one of them, and the world is watching to see. Scotland did their exoneration, and this has been happening in some places, but they are all watching. We actually have someone coming from Africa where this is still happening. There are over 60 countries, I believe, where witchcraft is still punishable by death, and they're going to be coming in the spring for a visit, so it'll be interesting.
Well, please join me in giving these great panelists a round of applause. And make sure you speak to your legislators if you have an opinion on this. All right, thanks everybody for coming, and thank you to the Old State House for having us for this conversation.